Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, be sure to drop your thoughts, feelings, and lessons in the comments below. Like the video and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's get into it. It happened at my 50th birthday dinner at Fleming's Steakhouse in Bellevue, Washington. The champagne kept moving, and the room kept humming, the kind of sound you only get when people are dressed well and trying to look important. My wife, Danielle Ellison, stood up, tapped her glass, and waited until the last laugh died. She smiled like she was about to do something generous. Then she said, "I think we all know who the real success story is in this marriage." She laughed that dry laugh I had learned to recognize. She tilted her chin toward me like I was a prop. "Paul Marcus still drives the same old Audi," she said, "while I just made partner." She raised her glass and added, "To my husband, who's been riding my coattails for 20 years. About 40 guests reacted at once. Some laughed because they thought they were supposed to, others laughed because they wanted to stay in her good graces. Our daughter, Naomi, home from her first year at Princeton, laughed the loudest. She did it without even lifting her eyes fully from her phone, like it was easy for her. People looked at me as if they expected an explosion. I did not give them one. I didn't argue. I didn't even clear my throat. I just smiled. I had learned that sometimes silence does more damage than shouting ever could. None of them knew what I knew. They didn't know every dollar in our joint accounts came from my family trust and from investments I had been managing quietly for decades. They didn't know the lake house Danielle liked to show off existed because I bought it outright. They didn't know Naomi's full ride was a story Danielle enjoyed repeating, while I paid every bill. I never flaunted it because I never wanted money to become our language. I looked around at the guests, Danielle's colleagues from Caldwell, Pierce and Hart, the country club couples, the neighbors from our Westlake Village circle when we lived in California, and the people who only called when they needed something. I saw them laughing at my expense, and something inside me settled into place, clean and final. I saw Danielle not as the woman I married, but as someone who had forgotten who I was and what held her life up. I stood quietly. I placed my napkin beside my untouched birthday cake. I walked out the front door of Fleming's without a speech, without a dramatic pause, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me plead. The February air hit my face and felt sharp enough to wake me fully. I got into my sensible Audi and drove away. They thought I was running. I wasn't. I was finally choosing. My name is Marcus Ellison. I turned 50 that night. On paper, I'm a financial advisor, but I haven't needed clients for years. I manage family investments, real estate, private equity, and early-stage tech bets that paid off. I keep things quiet because quiet keeps you safe, and because I never needed applause. Danielle always did. We met when we were both at Stanford. She was law track, and I was still pretending I had time. I left after my first year when my father died and the family responsibilities landed on me like a sealed order. Danielle stayed, graduated with honors, and held it over my head for years. She built her career with discipline at Caldwell, Pierce and Hart in Seattle. 20 years ago, her ambition looked like drive. Over time, it started looking like hunger. Not hunger for excellence, but hunger to be seen, to be feared, to be above. Naomi is 19, studying political science at Princeton. She is brilliant. She is also entitled in ways that didn't happen by accident. She learned it. I used to tell myself I was providing stability. I handled the finances, maintained the house, showed up to every school event, every soccer game, every meeting. Danielle missed plenty because she said she was building something. I believed her. I believed we were a team even when I was the only one acting like it. I can point to the moment the tone changed. 6 years earlier, Danielle was passed over for a partner the first time. She came home, kicked off her heels hard enough to crack the baseboard, poured a heavy scotch, and said, "They gave it to Grant." Her voice was flat, like she had already decided who to blame. I sat next to her, put my arm around her, and said, "I'm sorry. You deserved it." She stiffened under my touch and said, "What would you know about deserving partnership? You've never had to fight for anything." The words hit exactly where she aimed them. I told myself she was hurt, and I let it slide. I said, "Next time." She drained a glass and said, Next time I won't be naive. This isn't brilliance. It's politics and perception. Then she looked at me and said, we need changes. The changes came fast. Danielle stayed out later, networked harder, and turned our home into a rotating stage for dinners with senior partners. She upgraded her wardrobe, joined charity boards, and started playing golf even though she hated it. She was building a narrative, the brilliant attorney, the perfect wife, the civic leader. In that story, my role shrank. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was a background detail, expected to smile, clap, and not take up space. The first time I heard it out loud was at a neighbor's anniversary party. I was telling a simple story about a fishing trip in Montana. Nothing special, just something real. Danielle cut me off mid-sentence, patted my arm like I was a child, and said, Marcus, no one wants to hear about fishing. Then she turned to the group and said, let me tell you about the Harper merger. Everyone leaned in like she rang a bell. Later that night I told her that was humiliating. She didn't look up from her iPad. She said, don't be sensitive. No one wants fishing stories when we could discuss a $300 million deal. I said, that's not the point. She finally looked at me and said, then what is? You get to play golf while I build a career. The least you can do is recognize when you're a boring person. I walked away because any answer would be used against me. After that, I saw it everywhere. Danielle checked her phone when I spoke at dinner. At fame events, she introduced me as my husband Marcus with nothing else, like I had no identity worth stating. She consulted me less on decisions that affected all of us. Naomi mirrored it, rolling her eyes the way Danielle did, responding with short word when I asked real questions. I told myself it was a phase, and I told myself a lot of things that were convenient. One rainy Tuesday, I stopped by Danielle's office downtown because I was in the area meeting a startup founder. I thought I'd surprise her with lunch. The receptionist smiled and said, Mr. Ellison, it's good to see you. When I asked if Danielle was free, the smile changed. She's out to lunch with Mr. Pierce and the Westport team. I said, no problem, and asked her to let Danielle know I stopped by. The receptionist said Danielle left instructions not to be disturbed. As I waited for the elevator, Danielle's assistant, Kendra, came toward me quickly. She lowered her voice and said, Mr. Ellison, she isn't at lunch with Pierce. I raised my eyebrows, and Kendra glanced around like she was risking something. She's with Trevor Caldwell, she said. The founding partner's son. They've been having lunch a lot. The elevator opened. I stepped in and said, thank you. Kendra said, I just thought you should know. I didn't accuse Danielle of anything at that moment. Trevor was a direct path to power inside the firm. Cultivating him could be strategy. Still, that night Danielle came home close to 9 smelling like expensive perfume and carrying a Nordstrom bag. I asked casually, good meeting with Pierce. She answered, productive, without looking at me. I nodded toward the bag. What's that? She pulled out a burgundy silk tie and said, for you. Gala next month. We need to look perfect. I held the tie and said, what's the occasion? She said, the firm gala, kissed my cheek, and went upstairs. I'm exhausted. Don't wait up. I sat there with that tie in my hands longer than made sense. I couldn't tell if it was a gift, a cover, or just another item for her polished image. I didn't confront her because I needed certainty before I moved. Uncertainty is where people like Danielle keep you trapped. Later, I overheard Danielle on the phone with her sister. She said, Marcus is just watching sports. Content with the minimum. No ambition. She said it casually, like it was a summary, like 20 years of supporting her meant nothing. I was holding phone call records because I had been tracking unusual charges. The record showed long calls to a number I didn't recognize, placed while I was supposedly away. I didn't walk into the room. I didn't shout. I just listened, then folded the papers. That night, after Danielle took a sleeping pill, I checked her phone. The unknown number belonged to Trevor Caldwell. 3 calls, each over an hour, all late at night, timed with my trips. Business calls don't start at 11 and end after 1. I put the phone back, went downstairs, poured a drink, and asked myself a question that scared me. Was she having an affair? And did I even care? The fact that I didn't immediately know the answer told me everything. The next morning, I called my college roommate, Deshaun Price. Deshaun became a private investigator in Portland after years in law enforcement. I told him, I need information. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. On your wife? He asked. I said, on Trevor Caldwell and on Danielle's activities when I'm out of town. Deshaun paused, then said, you sure you want this? I said, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. He said, give me a week. That week moved like heavy water. I followed routines like a man performing a role. I asked Danielle about her cases. I smiled at Naomi on video calls. I made breakfast, cleaned up, answered emails, and kept my face neutral. Danielle didn't notice my internal shift because she had stopped looking closely. Naomi didn't notice because she didn't look at all. On the 7th day, Deshaun sent an encrypted file. I sat alone in my home office and opened it. The report said Trevor Caldwell had a reputation. 2 quiet settlements in 5 years. A pattern of pursuing women inside the firm, then resolving problems before they reached daylight. It said he was separated from his wife. It said he and Danielle had been seen together beyond work, dinners at the Four Seasons bar, drinks in Capitol Hill, and one night when Danielle entered Trevor's condo building near 10 and didn't leave until morning. The evidence wasn't poetic. It was practical, the kind that doesn't argue. I waited for anger, for heartbreak, for that familiar sense of being punched. What I felt instead was a cold clarity. This wasn't about love anymore, not for Danielle. It was about a story she was writing where I didn't belong. Trevor wasn't just a man, he was leveraged. And Danielle had chosen leverage over respect. I closed the file and sat in the dark. I realized I didn't need to scream to change everything. I needed to move quietly and precisely. Naomi was no better than Danielle in how she treated me. At Thanksgiving, I asked Naomi about her classes. How's political science? I asked. She said, fine, without looking up from her phone. Danielle jumped in and said, she's thriving. Professor Harmon says she's his most promising student. Naomi smiled at Danielle like they shared a secret. I asked, when did you speak to him? Danielle said, I have lunch with faculty when I'm in town for work. Networking is everything. Marcus. Then Danielle added, you'd know that if you'd finished law school. Naomi smirked like it was a good line. Naomi then announced, still talking to her mother, I got that internship with Senator Calloway. Mom's client recommended it to me. I said, that's wonderful. When were you going to tell me? Naomi shrugged. Danielle said, we discussed it last week. I sat there with my fork suspended, realizing decisions were being made around me, not with me. I had become an afterthought in my own home. After Thanksgiving, I went through our financial records with a different mindset. Naomi's scholarship was a story. My trust paid her tuition, her apartment, her travel, her spending. The lake house, on Mercer Island with a view across Lake Washington, was funded by an investment I made years earlier. Danielle hosted retreats there and spoke like she created it. For years, I stayed quiet because I believed partnership meant not keeping score. Now I saw my silence had allowed them to rewrite the truth and call it history. One gray afternoon, I walked alone by the water near the lake house. I thought about my father, who built our family business from the ground up and taught me that real success isn't applause. He used to say, don't let anyone make you feel small, not even the people you love. I had failed that lesson. I had let small dismissals pile up until shrinking felt normal. Standing there in the cold wind, I decided I would stop enabling a lie. I wouldn't beg. I would reset the terms. I started with small changes that were not small to Danielle. I declined the firm's holiday party and attended a board meeting for a tech incubator I funded. I moved investment documents from the shared home office to a private space downtown. I scheduled lunch with Princeton's political science dean, not as Danielle's husband, but as a donor exploring public service initiatives. Danielle noticed right away. She watched me pack an overnight bag and said, you're being weird. Where are you going? I said, San Jose. She frowned and said, you never mentioned this. I said, you never asked. She said, the Pierce dinner is Tuesday. I told them you'd be there. I paused and said, then you'll have to tell them I had a prior commitment. Danielle's eyes narrowed. This is important, she said. I said, so are my commitments. She asked, what's gotten into you? I answered, nothing. I'm honoring my own schedule for a change. I left before she could turn it into an argument. The San Jose meeting went well. The founder was building an AI healthcare platform for rural clinics. I invested and secured a board seat. The room treated my opinion like it mattered. I felt like myself again, decisive, respected, valued. When I returned, Danielle was cold. She said Margaret Pierce had asked about my absence and looked concerned. Danielle said, she thinks we're having problems. I asked, aren't we? Danielle's face flickered for a second, uncertainty. Then her phone buzzed. The moment vanished. She said, we're fine, while typing. Christmas came. I bought Danielle the diamond earring she had hinted at. She gave me a golf club renewal for the same club I'd already been in for years, the club where I hosted a charity tournament that raised $2 million for pediatric cancer research. She said, you spend so much time there anyway. Naomi gave me a Brooks Brothers gift card for exactly $100. When I thanked her, she said, Mom picked it out. I sat under the tree lights later, understanding the message without needing it spelled out. That week I met my attorney and trustee, Lionel Grant, a man who had handled my father's estate and my trust structure for decades. I told him, I need to make changes. I slid a folder across his desk. Lionel reviewed it carefully and said, you're restructuring almost everything. I said, yes. He asked, may I ask why? I said, an overdue correction. He nodded like he understood more than I said. He pointed to Naomi's trust provisions and said, these are significant. I said, she needs to learn what she's been given. Lionel asked, and your wife? I met his eyes and said, I'm done being Danielle's stepping stone. Lionel leaned back and said, once set in motion, these are difficult to reverse. I said, I'm not looking to reverse them. Then my birthday approached, February 18th, and Danielle insisted on a big dinner at Fleming's. 50 is a milestone, she said. We need to do it properly. I should have recognized it was not about me. It was about her, her image, her audience, her applause. The guest list proved it. 38 of Danielle's colleagues and social connections. 2 of my friends. Danielle went early to make sure everything was perfect. I drove myself and parked the Audi between her Tesla and a colleague's Porsche. I drove the Audi because it was reliable and paid off, not because it was all I could afford. Danielle had never cared about that kind of truth. When I walked in, she air-kissed me and announced, there's the birthday man, and then added, fashionably late, even though I wasn't. I circulated and accepted greetings from people who hesitated over my name. One of the few real moments came when my oldest friend, Terrence Shaw, pulled me aside and said, you hanging in there? I asked, what do you mean? He looked around at the crowd and said, this isn't you. I sighed and said, it's complicated. Terrence squeezed my shoulder and said, remember who you are. Don't get lost in her version of your life. I carried that sentence like a weight and a warning as I returned to the table. Dinner arrived. Filet mignon for most people, except Danielle and her inner circle who ordered sea bass like it was a signal. I sat at the center. Danielle sat to my right. A managing partner sat to my left. Naomi sat 3 seats away, whispering with Gregory Hale's Sun Like the Night was hers. Then Danielle stood and raised her glass and said, I'd like to make a toast. She said my name like it belonged to her. Then she delivered the line that snapped the last thread. We all know who the real success story is. She repeated the Audi joke. She repeated the riding my coattails line. Laughter rolled across the table like a rehearsed response. I saw a smirk on Gregory's face. I saw Naomi giggle behind her hand. I saw Terrence watching me from the far end with pity he tried to hide. At that moment, everything settled. I smiled. Not embarrassed, not pleading. Calm, clear, finished. I placed my napkin beside my plate, stood, and walked out without a word. No explanations. No performance. I refused to entertain them with my pain. Outside, the cold air felt honest. I drove to the Mercer Island Lake House instead of going home. The place was empty, clean, and quiet. I sat on the deck and looked across the water toward the Seattle skyline. My phone lit up with calls. Danielle, then Naomi, then Danielle again. I turned the phone off. For the first time in years, I let myself feel the humiliation and the truth underneath it. The truth was simple. I had been paying for a life where I was treated like a joke. I was done with that arrangement. In the morning, I drove to my downtown office, the private suite in a building I own on 4th Avenue. Danielle had always treated that office like it was a hobby because it didn't come with public applause. My assistant, Patrice Monroe, looked surprised when I walked in. She said, "Mr. Ellison, happy birthday." I said, "Belated, I guess." She said, "We didn't expect you." I said, "Plans changed. I need meetings with my attorney, my accountant, and the bank. Today." Patrice didn't ask why. She just started moving the way professionals do. By noon, my calendar was locked. Lionel arrived first. I said, "Execute the changes we discussed." "All of them." He raised his eyebrows but nodded. My banker followed. My accountant followed. The lake house was transferred solely into my name. Naomi's unlimited card was replaced with a modest limit and a clear budget. The trust structure was updated so tuition would continue. But the inheritance Naomi assumed she'd get at 25 would now depend on finishing school and completing 2 years of public service work. I wasn't punished. I was correcting a lie that had become a lifestyle. Then I handled what Danielle never imagined I could touch: her firm. Years earlier, Danielle asked me to invest quietly in Caldwell, Pierce & Hart through a holding company. She said, "It helps my position." I invested, and the stake grew over time. Danielle never asked for details, which told me she assumed there were none. The truth was my investment represented nearly 18% of their operating capital. I filed the paperwork to withdraw. It wouldn't destroy the firm, but it would squeeze cash flow, delay plans, and force leadership to explain themselves. Then I made a call to the founding partner, Russell Caldwell, Trevor's father. He answered warmly. "Marcus," he said, "Danielle just made partner. You must be thrilled." I said, "About that, I think we should meet." His tone shifted. "I see," he said. I said, "Noon tomorrow. The Metropolitan Grill." He agreed. That night I stayed at the lake house again. I didn't answer Danielle's messages. Let her sit in the dark for once. Let her experience what it was like to reach for something and find nothing there. The next morning Naomi texted, "Dad, where are you? Mom's freaking out." I replied, "I'm safe. I'm taking time." Naomi answered, "Whatever. Just call her." No concern from me, only irritation at the inconvenience. 3 hours later Naomi texted again. "Something's wrong with my credit card. Princeton called about tuition. Are you doing this?" I didn't reply. If Naomi wanted to understand the truth, she could sit with the discomfort long enough to learn it. At lunch, I laid out the facts for Russell Caldwell. The late-night calls. The dinners. Danielle enters Trevor's building and does not leave until morning. I also shared Deshawn's findings about Trevor's prior settlements. I said, "This pattern is a liability risk for your fam." Russell's face tightened. He didn't defend Trevor the way people do when they can't imagine their son doing wrong. He asked, "What do you want?" I said, "Trevor removed from leadership and a full review of harassment procedures." And Danielle's partnership reconsidered. Russell nodded slowly. Then he asked about my withdrawal. I said, "That stands." When I returned to the lake house, Danielle's Tesla was in the driveway, parked crooked like she arrived in a hurry. Danielle stepped toward me looking undone, hair not quite right, confidence frayed. She said, "What the hell are you doing?" She listed the credit cards, tuition, and the firm. She asked if I was having a breakdown. I looked at her and said, "No breakdown. Just clarity." She said, "You can't withdraw millions without notice." I said, "Watch me." She said, "Do you know what this does to my reputation?" I repeated, "Your reputation." I said, "Not the fact that you humiliated me in front of 40 people. Not the fact you've been meeting Trevor Caldwell. Just your position." Danielle went pale. She said, "How did you?" I said, "I've known for months." She tried to say it wasn't an affair, that it was complicated. I said, "It's simple. You saw an opportunity and you took it, regardless of the cost. She said, "That's not fair." I said, "What's not fair is turning your husband into a punchline when your husband bankrolled the whole stage." Danielle flinched and said, "So this is about money?" I said, "This is about respect." She said, "You're punishing me because you can't handle my success." I said, "I can't handle your success. I couldn't handle your contempt." She asked if I was divorcing her, cutting her off. I said, "I haven't decided. But I reclaimed what's mine: property, independence, dignity." Danielle's phone rang. She answered, and I could hear Russell's voice faintly. Danielle's face shifted through shock, then panic. She said, "Please," and then went quiet. When she hung up, she stared at me like I had become a stranger. She said, "They're suspending my partnership pending an ethics review. Trevor's on leave." Her voice rose. "Do you understand what you've done?" I said, "I did what you taught me. I played the game." Danielle stepped forward fast with her palm raised like she meant to slap me. I caught her wrist and said, "Don't." I released her. Tears filled her eyes. Real tears, not stage tears. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" I said, "I want you to understand what you threw away." 3 days later, Seattle legal circles were buzzing. Trevor's leave. Internal reviews. Danielle's partnership deferral. Danielle moved into a hotel, saying she needed space. The truth was she couldn't face the version of me she insisted didn't exist. Naomi flew home confused and angry. She found me at the lake house and said, "What's happening?" "Mom won't explain." I said, "Your mother made choices. Now she's facing consequences." Naomi asked about tuition and the card. I said, "Not punishing, teaching." She said Danielle told her I was jealous. I laughed once and said, "That's her story. Here's the truth." I told Naomi plainly, "Your tuition comes from me. Your apartment comes from me. The credit card comes from me." Naomi's eyes widened as if she couldn't fit that fact into her worldview. She said, "But Mom said," I cut in, "Your mother has been taking credit for my support for years." I said, "You can believe her if you want, but your lifestyle will reflect reality." Naomi didn't argue after that. She didn't apologize either. She just sat there in silence, finally hearing words that weren't softened for her comfort. Danielle tried reaching me through other people, her sister, mutual friends, even a lawyer. I didn't engage. 10 days after I walked out of Fleming's, Danielle came to the lake house alone. She looked tired, like someone who had finally run out of performance. She said, "I met with the ethics committee yesterday. They rescinded my partnership." I nodded. She said, "Trevor was terminated." Other complaints came forward once women felt safe. Danielle paused and tried to say it wasn't what I thought. I lifted my hand and said, "I don't care about details." The betrayal was respect. Danielle nodded like she couldn't deny it. She said, "I'm sorry, Marcus. For the toast, for Trevor, for all of it." I said, 20 years, and it took losing everything for you to see me." Danielle asked, "Can we fix this?" I looked at her and said, "I don't know. It won't be quick, and it won't be on your terms." Danielle left that night and went back to her hotel. I didn't chase her. I didn't plead. I didn't bargain. I just sat with the silence and noticed how peaceful it felt not to be managed. 2 weeks later, Trevor Caldwell called me. His voice carried controlled anger. He said, "Listen, we need to talk." I said, "Do we?" He said, "You ruined my career because your wife preferred my company." He tried to shame me like it would work. I said, "Is that what you told the other women before they filed complaints?" There was a pause. He called the accusations baseless. I said, "Yet you were terminated by your father's fam." He hissed, "This isn't over. I have connections." I said, "So do I. Mine aren't built on exploitation." Then I hung up. The rumors inside the legal community spread fast. People filled in blanks with whatever story entertained them. Some said Danielle embezzled. Some said she had an affair with a married partner. Some said she threatened a discrimination lawsuit. Most of it was wrong, but I didn't correct anyone. Danielle spent years controlling narratives. Now she could feel what it was like to lose control. One evening, Elaine Pierce called me, the wife of a senior partner. She said, "Marcus, darling, we've missed you. Is everything okay?" I said, "I'm re-evaluating priorities." She said, "We'd love you at the fundraiser next month. Just you." I understood what that meant. Danielle wasn't only losing a job. She was being cut out socially. The same people who laughed at her toast now acted like she was contagious. That world is loyal only to power. Danielle used to feed on that loyalty. Now she was starving without it. Naomi faced her own consequences. Princeton's financial aid office demanded paperwork, and without an unlimited card, she had to say no for the first time. Naomi called me late and said, "I'm struggling." I asked, "With what?" She said, "Everything. Forms, expenses, friends inviting me to New York." I said, "Welcome to how most people live." Naomi asked, "Why are you doing this now?" I said, "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm expecting responsibility." Naomi softened and said she found Danielle crying. I recognized the old angle. Use my empathy to restore her comfort. I said, "Your mother is an adult. So are you." Naomi asked if I was done with both of them. I said, "I'm done enabling behavior that diminishes me." There was silence. Then Naomi said, "Okay," like she didn't like the answer but couldn't argue with it. Spring moved forward with consequences. Naomi withdrew from Princeton after she couldn't secure the financial arrangement she wanted and refused the smaller allowance I offered. She transferred to the University of Washington. It was a good school, but it wasn't the trophy she expected to carry. Danielle searched for work and discovered how quickly prestige evaporates when people whisper behind your name. After months, she accepted a position at a small family law practice in Tacoma. It paid less, carried less status, and required her to do real work without a spotlight. She sold the Tesla and moved into a modest apartment. One rainy afternoon, Danielle came to my downtown office without an appointment. Patrice hesitated before letting her in. I told Patrice, "It's fine." Danielle sat across from me in simple clothes. Her eyes looked different, less sharp, less certain. She said, "I've been thinking. I've been in therapy." I nodded. She said, "I thought success meant partnership and recognition. I thought if I achieved enough, I'd feel worthy." Then she said, "All I did was destroy the one real thing I had." I said, "Our marriage was real once." Danielle said, "I stopped seeing you." She took a breath and said, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a second chance. I just needed you to know I understand what I lost, who I lost." I watched her face for calculation and didn't see it. Then she asked for something smaller than what old Danielle would demand. She said, "Maybe we don't start over as husband and wife. Maybe we start as people who knew each other once." I didn't answer immediately. I said, "I'm grilling at the lake house Friday. Nothing fancy. You're welcome to come." Danielle's small smile looked unpracticed. She said, "I'd like that." As she stood to leave, she paused and said, "For what it's worth, I'm proud of what you did, standing up for yourself." She didn't say it like a compliment she could spend later. She said it like a fact. After she left, I sat alone and watched rain crawl down the windows of a building I owned. I didn't know if trust could be rebuilt. I didn't know if our marriage deserved revival. But I knew I would never shrink again to fit someone else's story. Friday came. Naomi arrived first, quiet in a way she wasn't used to being. She looked tired, like someone who had been forced into reality without training wheels. She said, "I'm working part-time." I nodded. She didn't brag about it. She said it like she couldn't believe she had to. I asked about school. She answered with real sentences instead of one-word replies. Then Danielle arrived. She didn't walk in like she owned the room. She walked in like she understood the room wasn't hers to control anymore. We ate on the deck because the air was cold but clean. The conversation stayed simple. Naomi talked about transferring. Danielle talked about Tacoma work without dressing it up. I talked about the incubator board and about a new investment in a logistics platform in Chicago. Nobody toasted. Nobody performed. At one point, Naomi asked Danielle, "Why did you say those things at the party?" Danielle looked down and said, "Because I thought it was funny, and because I wanted people to clap for me." Naomi looked at me, then back at Danielle, like she was seeing her mother for the first time without the shine. After dinner, Naomi went inside to take a call. Danielle stayed on the deck with me. She said, "I know sorry doesn't fix it." I didn't argue. Danielle said, "I used your silence to pretend you didn't matter." I said, "Yes, you did." She said, "I can't change the past." I said, "No." Danielle asked, "Is there any path forward?" I said, "There's a path for truth. There's a path for accountability. Whether there's a path for marriage depends on whether you can live without needing to be above me." Danielle nodded slowly, as if hearing the actual requirement for the first time. She said, "I don't want to be above you. I want to be equal again." I said, "Then you'll need to act like it, not say it." Danielle accepted that without argument. That alone was new. When she left, she didn't demand a promise. She didn't try to squeeze emotion out of me. She just said, "Thank you for dinner," and drove away. Naomi watched from the window, then came back out and said, "That was different." I said, "It is now." In the weeks that followed, I kept boundaries clear. Danielle didn't get access to my accounts again. Naomi didn't get an unlimited card again. They both learned to ask instead of assume. Danielle attended therapy and kept working in Tacoma. Naomi kept her job and adjusted to a different kind of student life. I didn't soften the consequences just because they were uncomfortable. I had spent too long absorbing discomfort so they could avoid it. My job now was not to keep them comfortable. My job was to keep myself intact. One afternoon, Naomi came to the lake house without Danielle. She sat across from me and said, "I didn't realize how disrespectful I was." I didn't rescue her from the shame. I let her say it. She said, "I thought you were just there." I said, "I was there, and you treated that like it was nothing." Naomi nodded. She said, "Mom made it seem like you didn't do anything." I said, "Your mother liked stories that kept her on top. You accepted them because they benefited you." Naomi didn't argue. She just said, "I'm trying to unlearn it." Danielle called me one night and asked if I would meet her in a public place, somewhere neutral. I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe in Kirkland. Danielle didn't arrive dressed like court. She arrived like a person. She said, "I'm learning how to exist without applause." I said, "Good." She said, "When the phone dropped me, I realized how many people were only around because they thought I had power." I said, "That's the world you chose." Danielle nodded and said, "I see that now." She didn't blame me, which was new. She asked, "Do you hate me?" I said, "I hated what you did. I hated what I allowed." Danielle looked like she wanted to defend herself, then stopped. She said, "I used to think your calm meant you didn't care." I said, "My calm meant I cared enough not to turn us into a battlefield." You took it as weakness. Danielle whispered, "I did." I said, "If we move forward, it will be with full truth and with respect, not with performances." Danielle nodded. She said, "I can do that." I said, "We'll see." The summer came with quieter routines. Danielle kept her apartment but came to the lake house sometimes for dinner, never uninvited, never demanding. Naomi stayed in Seattle for a summer class and her job. She learned to budget and to plan. The first time she paid for her own train ticket to Portland to see friends, she told me about it like it mattered. It did. Danielle asked me once if I would consider couples counseling. I said yes, with one condition: no weaponizing sessions, no turning it into a stage. Danielle agreed. In counseling, Danielle admitted she had equated respect with status. She admitted she feared being ordinary. She admitted she had watched people clap for her and felt alive, then looked at home and felt trapped. I said what I had never said before. I felt invisible. I felt used. I felt like a paycheck and a prop. Danielle didn't argue. She said, "You were." Then she said, "I'm ashamed." I told her shame is useless unless it changes. She wrote that down like it was law. Months later, Danielle invited me to watch Naomi speak at a campus event. Naomi was presenting on public service policy. Naomi looked nervous, then looked into the crowd and found me. She didn't look past me. She looked at me. Afterward, she hugged me first, not because Danielle prompted her, but because she chose to. Naomi said, "Thank you for not letting me stay spoiled." I said, "You did the work." Danielle stood nearby and didn't step between us. That mattered, too. I never returned to Fleming's with Danielle. That place had a memory I didn't need to revisit. But I did return to myself. I traveled again for my own work, not as an accessory. I expanded investments into Atlanta-adjacent markets without ever needing to mention Atlanta itself, because I wasn't trying to impress anyone with geography. I spent time with Terrence and with Deshawn, people who spoke to me as a man, not a label. Danielle slowly learned that love without respect is just an arrangement. Naomi learned that privilege without gratitude is rot. I don't tell people we lived happily ever after, because that would be another performance. What I can say is this: I stopped accepting contempt. I stopped buying silence with my dignity. Danielle lost the life she took for granted and started rebuilding a life she could actually live inside. Naomi lost the fantasy of effortless status and started earning her place with real effort. And I finally remembered what my father tried to teach me from the beginning. No one gets to make me small without my permission. If this story had you locked in, make sure you subscribe for more raw lifestyle betrayal and karma stories like this, because the next one is even more intense. And tell me in the comments, should Marcus have taken Danielle back, or should he have walked away for good? The end.